Our short story was titled Old Woman Magoun and was written by Mary E. Wilkins. The summary of our short story is that it shows a grandmother named Old Woman Magoun taking care of her granddaughter Lily after Lily's mother died and her father left. One day, Lily's father, Barry, who is considered an evil figure in the community, comes to get Lily. Barry comes to get Lily in order to sell her as a sex slave to a man named Jim Willis to pay off his gambling debt. To stop Lily from being taken by her father, Old Woman Magoun does not stop Lily from eating poisonous berries on their walk back home. By the time Barry gets to the house to take Lily, she is too far gone to save or to call someone to help, and Old Woman Magoun feels as though she has protected Lily. Biographical information. Mary E. Wilkins' background. She was born on October 31st, 1852, and she was one of 2 children out of 4 that survived to adulthood. In 1868, she moved from Massachusetts to Vermont, and she graduated from Brattleboro High School and went to Mount Holyoke Cemetery for a year before continuing her education at Mrs. Horsford's Glenwood Cemetery. Mary E. Wilkins Freeman work. Mary grew up reading lots of poetry and fairy tales, and she soon began writing religious poetry. In her later works, Mary wrote strong female characters and reserved male counterparts. She primarily wrote with her setting in New England, and she is most famous for her 2 collections of stories called A Humble Romance and Other Stories, and A New England Nun and Other Stories. Mary E. Wilkins Freeman late life. In 1902, Freeman met Dr. Charles Manning Freeman in New Jersey, and they got married in January 1902. Through the rest of her career, she wrote short stories, worked on a film, and wrote 11 more volumes. However, Dr. Charles Manning was an alcoholic and drug addict, and he was committed to the New Jersey State Hospital for the Insane in 1920. Mary died on March 15, 1930, and was buried in Plainfield, New Jersey. Biographical lens. Mary E. Wilkins' first husband, Dr. Charles Manning, was an avid alcoholic and womanizer and was committed to a mental hospital, and the couple separated a year later. When Freeman died, he left the majority of his money to his chauffeur and only $1 to his former wife. The reflections of her past experiences can be seen in the character of Nelson Barry and Jim Willis and the womanizing experience that Lily receives. The first quote we see this in is when Barry says, "I want her." From this quote, we see that Barry sees Lily as an object to acquire rather than as a person. Barry is demonstrating the traits of a womanizer here by just seeing Lily as a sex object to pay off his gambling debt. This reflects Mary E. Wilkins' past life because her husband was known for being a womanizer. Mary E. Wilkins, writing Barry, shows this personality trait of her ex-husband, Dr. Charles Manning Freeman. Another quote where we see this is when Old Woman Magoun is speaking, and she says, "You have been playing cards and you lost, and this is the way you will pay him." This quote also shows a character trait of Mary E. Wilkins' ex-husband. Wilkins is very familiar with a male figure who gambles and drinks, and she uses her past experiences in this area to give Barry these traits as well. This gives the character a more realistic feel because it seems as though he was written off of someone because of how Mary E. Wilkins wrote it based off her husband. A third quote where we see this is when it says, "Lily died that night. Old Woman Magoun continued to live as she had done before." From this quote, we see how heavily Wilkins was influenced by the work of writers before her. As a child, Wilkins enjoyed reading works by female authors, and as a writer, Wilkins tended to write stories that featured a strong female character and a weaker male counterpart. We see this idea of a strong female character in Old Woman Magoun. Old Woman Magoun was able to do what she had to do to protect Lily and to keep her safe, and once it was over, she was able to put it behind her and move on because she knew that she had done the right thing in order to keep Lily safe from Barry. The 2 discussion questions for the biographical lens is, do you believe that Mary E. Wilkins' background reading fairy tales caused this story to have a whimsical feeling? Why or why not? The second question is, do you think that Mary's sibling dying before she reached adulthood influenced the lack of siblings in this short story? Why or why not?
The next lens is the gender feminist lens. There are clear gender roles seen in this story. Old Woman Magoun takes care of her granddaughter now that her mother, which was Old Woman Magoun's daughter, has passed away, instead of having her father, which is Nelson Barry, take her in. Her father got upset once he saw his daughter again and insisted that Old Woman Magoun give Lily to him. Old Woman Magoun's motherly role came out, and she resisted. But Nelson Barry said that he and his sister would take a very good care of Lily and that Old Woman Magoun should not worry. Nelson Barry was actually going to sell Lily to Jim Willis in order to pay off his debts. This would not be acceptable for a mother to do, but since it is a man, no one batted an eye. Also, there are clear gender roles in what everyone expects from Lily. Everyone is shocked that Lily is still acting like a child with her old rag doll, and that a lot of people think that she's younger than 10, even though she's supposedly 14 years old. It seems that Old Woman Magoun is trying to keep Lily a child for as long as possible, because she is terrified of what happened to her daughter, which is Lily's mother, and doesn't want that to happen to Lily because she lost Lily's mother. It is revealed by Nelson that Lily's mother was only 3 years older than Lily, and she was having children, so it was shocking that Lily seemed so young. This shows the societal standard that women should be having children while they are young, because that was their main purpose at the time. If they weren't bearing children or weren't able to, they were looked down upon. Since Old Woman Magoun did not want that to happen to Lily, she took it upon herself to make it look like Lily got sick from sour apples and milk, but actually, she allowed Lily to eat poisonous berries. And then these are the quotes that go along with it. Her mother was only 3 years older when Lily was born. Wilkins Freeman, page 9. This quote shows how it was normalized in society during this time period for girls to start having children very young. Old Woman Magoun was looked down upon for how she is raising Lily, and the people in town think that Lily needs to start to learn to mature because she is very far behind the other young girls in their town. And the next quote is, "I'm going to have the girl. That is the long and short of it," he said, "and it is for her best good, too. You're a fool, or you would see it." Wilkins Freeman, page 9. Nelson Barry is a man, and men during this time period were seen as above women in all decision-making. As seen here, Nelson Barry is trying to make Old Woman Magoun look stupid for her decisions. Nelson Barry knows that he will eventually get his way and will be able to take the child away from Old Woman Magoun. Next is the feminist part of this lens. Old Woman Magoun exhibits feminist qualities because at the time, there was a clear division in the status of men and women. Old Woman Magoun wanted a bridge to be built by the end of the summer, and she was not afraid to tell the men that were working on it exactly what she wanted and didn't want. She also made it very clear that she did not like how they cussed at work, and even if they did, she was not going to be afraid of them. Even though she's a woman, all of the working men listened to her and obeyed her, which was very rare at the time. She goes out of her way to protect her granddaughter in the only way she believed she could at the time. And then these are the quotes that go along with it. "If I were a man," said she, "I'd go out this very minute and lay the first log. If I were a passel of lazy men laying around, I'd start up for once in my life. I would." Wilkins Freeman, page 1. This quote shows how Old Woman Magoun knows her limits as a woman during this time period, but she has thought about what she would do if she were a man. She knows that she would be very hardworking and not be lazy like the men she watches. She's aware that women can be hardworking, and if they were allowed in the workforce, they would probably be more productive than these men that she watches all day. The next quote is, "The weakness of the masculine element in Barry's Ford was laid low before such strenuous feminine assertion." Wilkins Freeman, page 1. This quote shows how Old Woman Magoun asserted her power even though she is a woman, and was surprisingly able to get the men to listen to her. This is powerful because oftentimes men would brush off assertions from women because they were lower in status and intelligence than men. Old Woman Magoun was able to exhibit a powerful female character that made many sacrifices for her family and town. And then these are the gender feminist lens discussion questions. How do the gender roles at the time impact how Old Woman Magoun protects Lily from Nelson Barry and Jim Willis? How do you think she would protect her differently today? And how do you think Old Woman Magoun would help fight for women's rights and their protection from sexual harassment and abuse if she were alive today?
So the social power / Marxist lens examines the manner that power, economics, class differences, and fairness in society are represented in the story. In a way, a lot of the conflict in Old Woman Magoun stems from this social and Marxist power clash. Old Woman Magoun is of the working class, as well as most of the characters introduced in the story, besides the Barrys and the Willises, notably. So first things first, the Barry family is a higher economic class than Old Woman Magoun. Therefore, she's expected to look past their wrongdoings and sort of kowtow to them. However, she doesn't, and she is a notable figure in their community because of that rebellion against that economic depression. This is seen in the quote to the left, where they mark Nelson Barry as a degenerate of a good old family, and Old Woman Magoun as brave for defying the evil deity Nelson Barry. So the quote reads, "Lily's father, Nelson Barry, was the fairly dangerous degenerate of a good old family. And second, the shiftless population of Barry's Ford looked up to him as an evil deity. They wondered how Old Woman Magoun dared brave him as she did." Second, the plot is very much driven by this economic tension. Old Woman Magoun, who is clearly a more present caretaker to Lily than Nelson Barry, her actual father, is denied adoption to Lily as a last resort to save her from becoming a child bride, or worse, due to the Barry blood in her veins, as shown in the fourth quote. This economic class gap keeps the lower class from going against the higher class, which are the Barrys. Additionally, the Willises are also part of this upper class, which is one reason why the Barrys and the Willises seem so close and so dangerous. They gamble together, which leads Willis to ask for Lily in the first place, and this seems to be intentionally overlooked by the rest of the community, and even Old Woman Magoun senses that it is inevitable to try and keep Lily from going with Nelson Barry, unless she was able to adopt her, which she wasn't. So it's important to distinguish how the author's economic class contributes to this story and how each class is represented. Emily Wilkins Freeman grew up in poverty during a depression, and so her short stories often portray the upper class as corrupt, as villainous, and just essentially morally skewed. And so this is shown here in the story with the Barrys and the Willises being in positions of power in their communities and still able to be openly corrupt due to their status. This text definitely reproduces the belief that the upper classes were corrupt, as Emily Wilkins Freeman seems to believe, and so as a means of control, the text also goes to reinforce the class and power and inequality between the two classes. I definitely drew some connections to Hamlet in that the class divide was a point of conflict. While yes, there are more obvious connections with the death by poison, dead parent, some definite father issues, etc., I also connected Hamlet's rebellion to Claudius's sort of oppression with Old Woman Magoun's rebellion against Nelson Barry. Additionally, the economic class divide between the Denmark royals and the servants and non-royals give the royals a little more freedom to almost do what they like, and these happenings sort of be overlooked, like how the Barrys and the Willises seem to be able to do in the short story. In summation, I enjoyed the way that Wilkins Freeman used foreshadowing with Lily admiring the Barrys, but also the nod to having the Barry family name be reminiscent of the way Lily dies. In my opinion, it creates a juxtaposition, a sort of choice between the Barrys and the Barrys, with either sort of being a lose-lose situation and just having to choose the lesser of two evils. I also noticed that the story seems to hint at Old Woman Magoun having killed Lily's mother pre-narrative to save her from Nelson Barry as well. Which leads me to my discussion questions, being how does the economic class gap impact the narrative of the story? And how are Mary E. Wilkins' own economic class and opinions represented in the story?
So I had the psychological lens. First, let's analyze Old Woman Magoun. Old Woman Magoun obviously suffers from a mild level of depression from her daughter's death and anxiety over losing Lily. So I had the psychological lens. First, let's analyze Old Woman Magoun. Old Woman Magoun obviously suffers from a mild level of depression from her daughter's death and anxiety over losing Lily. After Lily's mother got pregnant at the age of 16 and was supposed to be married away, Old Woman Magoun decided to poison her with berries in order to save her in some ways. Although Woman Magoun felt that she was doing the right thing by saving her, it led her to a sort of depression and mourning after losing someone that she loved. Due to losing her daughter at a young age, Old Woman Magoun became very protective of Lily and would not allow her to grow up and often sheltered her from the real world. The intense anxiety that Old Woman Magoun felt for Lily growing up caused a stunt in Lily's life. Seen in this first quote about Old Woman Magoun, it says, Old Woman Magoun continued to live as she had done before. She supported herself by the produce of her tiny farm. She was very industrious, but people said that she was a trifle touched. Wilkins, page 18. In this quote, it can be seen that Old Woman Magoun lived a pretty secluded and lonesome life. This was because the people respected her, but left her alone because they knew that she was somewhat crazy after the death of Lily's mother. The solitary definitely fed into Old Woman Magoun's depression and her ability to shelter Lily, and in some ways fed into her anxiety as well. Next there leads to the quote that says, she did not often go to the store, which was his favorite haunt. Her grandmother took care that she should not do so. Wilkins 2. This quote shows the extent that Old Woman Magoun's anxiety took over her life to the point that she would not let Lily even leave the house because she was worried about her father finding out about her. The feat that haunts Old Woman Magoun is so severe that Lily barely even leaves the house, which ties into the last quote we saw, which shows the solitude that the family follows. Last we see, it says, I know she's got a beautiful color, replied Old Woman Magoun, with an odd mixture of pride and anxiety. But it comes and it goes. Wilkins 3. This last quote shows the direct anxiety that Old Woman Magoun has over Lily. Old Woman Magoun knows that Lily is a beautiful young girl, and in some ways she is proud that Lily has turned out so pretty. but she also has anxiety over Lily being pretty because she knows that it will cause men to chase after Lily even at a young age. Lastly, on this next slide, there's a quote that says, "The old woman loosened her grasp. Grandma didn't know how tight she was holding your hand," said she. "She wouldn't hurt you for nothing, except it was to save your life," or something like that. She spoke with an undertone of tremendous meaning, which the girl was too childish to grasp. This quote is interesting because it shows that the grandma is crazy enough to hurt her granddaughter if it meant that she would be saving her in the end. It is also interesting to note that it says she says this with tremendous meaning, which the girl was too childish to grasp, which is funny because it means that the grandmother had been thinking about this a lot, or at least had done this before, which can be inferred that it was from when Old Woman Magoun killed Lily's mother as well. Next, it is important to analyze Lily. Lily is a young 14-year-old girl who knows nothing more than her life at the house with her grandmother. She is definitely way less mature than most girls her age and still carries around a doll everywhere she goes. The doll, in a way, symbolizes her childhood and her youth. In some ways, Lily could be compared to a way less severe version of Stockholm Syndrome. Since Lily has only ever known her grandmother, she develops a trust in her grandmother and never accepts that her grandmother could be wrong about some things. The first quote, "Little Lily has never been allowed to run with the other children of Barry's Fort," shows how Lily was sheltered from the other kids in the real world. This puts a dent in children's childhood because they can become lonely and possibly depressed, much like Old Woman Magoun in Solitary. Next quote says, "Lily Berry went on her way to the store. She was clad in a scanty short frock of blue cotton. Her hat was tipped back, forming an oval frame for her innocent face. She was very small and walked like a child with the clap of little feet and babyhood. She might have been considered from her looks under 10. This quote highlights not only the mindset of a child that she contains, but also the looks. When it emphasizes her as having an innocent face and childish feet, this emphasizes her youth and what to blame Old Woman Magoun for. The last quote, which says, "Lily told her, in a little faltering, frightening voice, all of the conversation which she could recall." It sounded harmless enough. It shows the innocence that Lily contains and the naivety she contains as well. As Lily recalls what happened with her father at the store, she believes that it was just a normal conversation, but she doesn't understand that she was put her own life at risk because she doesn't understand due to being sheltered her whole life. Lastly, it's important to analyze Jim Willis and in some ways Nelson Berry as well. Both men are avid drinkers and gamblers, which more than likely stems from some sort of past trauma and the expectations and pressures of society. Obviously, Nelson Berry is also a pedophile, which can be seen through Lily's move. And there's obviously enough that Nelson Berry was willing to sell his daughter off to Jim Willis to repay his gambling bet, which can be seen in this quote that says, "I know what it is," she cried. "You have been playing cards and you lost, and this is the way you will pay him back." And this is seen when Old Woman Magoun calls out Nelson Berry, Lily's father, for gambling Lily off to his friend Jim Willis, who is also a pedophile. And Old Woman Magoun worries that what's going to happen to Lily is what happened to Lily's mother. And speaking that Jim Willis wants a 14-year-old daughter for his wife, obviously he is a pedophile and has some sort of past trauma that we can see here in this story. So that leads me to my last two discussion questions. How does Old Woman Magoun's past trauma with Lily's mother affect her relationship with Lily? And would the story have played out differently if Lily was less sheltered, and how so? Next, there is the archetypes lens. The first archetype to analyze is in Lily. Lily takes on the child archetype because Lily literally is the child in the story, and as well she is the archetype of the child. Some of the characteristics of the child are optimism, enthusiasm, naivety, and physical powerlessness, and these all fit into Lily's personality because she is optimistic and enthusiastic when meeting new people, which can be seen when she meets a stranger on the road and when she takes candy from her father. However, she is also naive when meeting her father and trusting him and her grandmother. Lastly, it is a physical powerlessness which can be seen in this quote, which it says, "Lily told in her little faltering, frightening voice all of the conversation which she could recall, and it sounded harmless enough." And you can see here that she is physically powerless of the stress that her grandmother is giving her and against her father and against just in general men, and that's why she leads to thinking of this conversation that she had. Next, there is Old Woman Magoun, which is given the archetype of the caregiver. Old Woman Magoun cared for Lily from the time she was a baby and also takes care of the workers on the bridge when she makes them dinner and has all of them over for a feast. She's generous and selfless, but she also has a desire to protect others, and this leads her to her downfall because she tries to protect Lily too much, which can be seen in this quote that says, "But Old Woman Magoun had within her a mighty sense of reliance upon herself as being on the right track in the midst of a maze of evil, which gave her courage." And in this quote, we can see that she feels like she is in evil, but that she has enough courage to keep Lily away from her father and to raise her much like a caregiver would. And then lastly, we have Nelson Barry. Nelson Barry is the villain in this story. Nelson Barry is a selfish and evil and only focuses on getting what he wants. This can be seen in the idea that he is willing to trade off his daughter to pay off his gambling bets, as well as in this quote that says, "Her father bent down and for the first time in her life kissed her, and the whiskey odorous breath came into her face. Lily involuntarily started and shrank away from it, when she rubbed her mouth violently with her little cotton handkerchief, which she held gathered up with a rag doll." This quote shows that Nelson Barry was already off and weird, and that he would kiss his daughter after not knowing her for years on end, and after drinking as well. And you can tell that from Lily's reaction, she did not like it, which kind of makes him not the traditional villain of being evil, but the fact that he would stay away from his own daughter for her whole life, and then have the power to kiss her and just pretend that he likes her. So lastly are the discussion questions. Why is it important that Nelson Barry is the villain and Lily's father at the same time? And how does Old Woman Magoun differ from the traditional caregiver archetype? And now we just wanted to make some connections of our short story Old Woman Magoun to the book Beloved, which we are all reading as a class. The story of Beloved highlights the murder of the child nicknamed Beloved because Setha feels that it would be saving her from slavery when the slave owner comes to get her and the rest of the kids. And this is actually very similar to what Old Woman Magoun does in our story, because once Old Woman Magoun knows that Lily is going to be traded off by her father to Jim Willis, she kills her with the berries in order to save her from being married at the age of 14 to an older man and basically just being used for sex. And so this is a lot of similarities to when Setha killed Beloved because she didn't want her to go into slavery. And there's also some parallels between Old Woman Magoun and Baby Suggs and their biblical representation of Jesus and the community leader. This one is definitely not as close, but you can see a few parallels because Baby Suggs used to host these sermons and had everyone come and gave them these lessons and have everyone dance and got together and provided food for them. And this is pretty similar to Old Woman Magoun in some ways because Old Woman Magoun prepares these big feasts and has all the men who are working on the bridge come in and eat, and then they celebrate there. And so that also kind of represents Jesus being the community leader and having everyone together for a feast. Although, of course, this one isn't